The doctor says there's nothing wrong with your leg. I stared at the phone in my hand. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Patricia Chen, the specialist I'd driven 4 hours to see. She'd been reviewing my medical files all morning. Now, sitting in her office in Portland, she was telling me something that made no sense. Nothing wrong? I repeated. Your leg is completely healthy, Ms. Ellis. The words didn't register. I'd lost my left leg below the knee. The amputation happened 3 years ago. My prosthetic sat in the corner of my bedroom at home, a constant reminder of that surgery, of the pain that came before, of the life that ended the day they wheeled me into the operating room. I don't understand, I said. Dr. Chen's voice became careful, measured. I've reviewed every scan, every test result, every imaging study from the past 5 years. There was no gangrene, no infection, no vascular disease, no reason for amputation. The phone felt heavier in my hand. I couldn't breathe properly. My chest felt tight, squeezed by something invisible. That's impossible, I whispered. I'm going to recommend you get a second opinion immediately, and I need to ask you something. Who performed your surgery? I told her. Dr. Marcus Webb, the orthopedic surgeon who'd been my physician for 8 years. The man I'd trusted completely. The man who'd sat across from me in his office and explained, with charts and diagrams, why my leg had to come off. The man who'd held my hand before surgery and promised everything would be better afterward. 3 years. 3 years of phantom pain. 3 years of physical therapy. 3 years of learning to walk again with a prosthetic that never quite felt right. 3 years of depression, of isolation, of watching my life shrink down to something manageable but diminished. 3 years of believing I'd done everything right, that I'd made the hard choice, that I'd survived something terrible, and now a doctor was telling me I never needed any of it. I hung up the phone and sat in Dr. Chen's waiting room for 20 minutes without moving. The receptionist asked if I was okay. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The world had shifted. Everything I'd believed about my own body, my own medical history, my own suffering, all of it was suddenly suspect. All of it was suddenly a lie. The drive home took 4 hours. I don't remember most of it. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I remember pulling over twice because my vision blurred. I remember arriving at my house in Salem and sitting in the driveway for an hour, staring at nothing. My daughter, Keisha, found me there. She was 28, worked in marketing, and had the kind of life I'd always wanted for her: independent, successful, untethered. She'd been devastated when I lost my leg. She'd been there through all of it. She'd held my hand during physical therapy. She'd cried with me on the bad days. Mom? She tapped on the car window. Are you okay? I looked at her and felt something break inside me. I got out of the car and told her everything. I told her about Dr. Chen. I told her what the specialist had said. I told her that my amputation might have been unnecessary. Keisha's face went pale. She pulled me into a hug, but I could feel her shaking. That can't be right, she said. That can't be real. But it was. And as I stood in my driveway with my daughter holding me, I realized something else was happening. The shock was fading. In its place came a different feeling, a hot, sharp feeling that burned in my chest like acid. Rage. That evening, I called my attorney. Her name was Diane Rothschild, and she'd handled my divorce 15 years earlier. She was sharp, methodical, and had a reputation for being relentless with insurance companies. I told her what Dr. Chen had found. I told her about the surgery. I told her I thought something illegal had happened. Diane was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I need to see everything. Every medical record, every insurance claim, every communication with Dr. Webb's office? Can you get me those? I had most of it already. 3 years of medical documentation stored in boxes in my basement. I'd kept everything because I'd wanted to understand what happened to me. I'd wanted to be able to explain my condition to new doctors, new physical therapists, new people in my life. I'd wanted proof that I hadn't been careless, that I hadn't done this to myself. Now, I wanted proof of something else entirely. The next morning, I started pulling boxes from the basement. My hands moved through the papers methodically, almost mechanically. Insurance forms, doctor's notes, lab results, imaging reports, physical therapy records. Each document was a piece of a story I thought I understood. Now, reading them again with fresh eyes, I began to see things I'd missed before. Dr. Webb's initial assessment mentioned significant vascular compromise. But the ultrasound report that should have accompanied that assessment wasn't in the file. I found a note from his office saying the ultrasound had been inconclusive and recommending an MRI instead. But there was no MRI report. Instead, there was a handwritten note from Dr. Webb saying, "Patient refuses additional imaging. Proceeding with surgical intervention based on clinical presentation." I had never refused any imaging. I'd been terrified and desperate for answers. I would have agreed to any test, any procedure, anything that might help me understand what was happening to my body. The insurance claim was for $175,000. The surgery was coded as an emergency amputation due to acute vascular disease. The insurance company had approved it within 48 hours. No questions asked. No second opinion required. No independent verification. I called the insurance company that afternoon. After 40 minutes of being transferred between departments, I reached a claims adjuster named Robert. I explained the situation. I told him what Dr. Chen had found. I told him I was questioning whether the surgery should have ever been approved. Robert's voice became defensive. "We approve the claim based on the documentation provided by the treating physician. If there's a question about the medical necessity of the procedure, you need to take that up with the physician." "The physician is the one I'm questioning?" I said. "Then you need to file a formal complaint with the state medical board." He hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand, listening to the dial tone, understanding that I just stepped into a process that would take months, maybe years, to navigate. Keisha came over that evening. She brought wine and sat at my kitchen table while I spread out all the medical documents. She was a smart woman, organized and detail-oriented. She read through everything slowly, methodically, the way she approached work problems. Halfway through, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "None of this makes sense." "I know." "Did you ever question it at the time? Did you ever ask for a second opinion?" I had to think about that. 3 years ago, I'd been in pain. I'd been frightened. Dr. Webb had been my doctor for years. He'd treated me for a knee injury, for a sprained ankle, for the usual things that happen to a woman in her 50s. When he told me my leg was dying, I'd believed him. I'd had no reason not to believe him. "No," I said. I trusted him. Keisha reached across the table and took my hand. "We're going to figure this out, Mom. We're going to get answers." I filed a complaint with the Oregon Medical Board that week. I sent copies of all my medical records to Diane. I requested Dr. Webb's complete file on my case from his office. I began researching what it meant to have an unnecessary amputation. I learned about insurance fraud. I learned about unnecessary surgeries. I learned that it happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. What I didn't expect was how much it would hurt to learn the truth. 2 weeks after I filed the complaint, Dr. Webb's office called. His administrator, a woman named Sandra, asked if I would come in for a meeting. She said Dr. Webb wanted to discuss my concerns directly. I almost hung up on her, but I didn't. I wanted to see his face. I wanted to hear him explain what he'd done. The office looked exactly as I remembered it. The same waiting room with the same magazines. The same receptionist, though she looked older. The same hallway with the photographs of Dr. Webb at medical conferences, receiving awards, looking competent and trustworthy. Dr. Webb came out to greet me personally. He was a man in his 60s, with gray hair and the kind of calm demeanor that had always made me feel safe. Now, looking at him, I felt something else entirely. "Olena," he said, extending his hand. "It's so good to see you. How are you doing?" I didn't shake his hand. I walked past him into his office and sat down without waiting to be invited. Dr. Webb closed the door and sat across from me. His expression shifted slightly, the warmth fading from his face. "I understand you've been to see another specialist, Dr. Chen?" "How did you know that?" "She contacted me directly. She said you were questioning the medical necessity of your amputation." My stomach tightened. "Is that true? Did she contact you?" "Yes. She was concerned about the documentation in your file." I leaned forward. "Dr. Webb, I've had your records reviewed by an independent specialist. She says there was no reason to amputate my leg. She says my leg was healthy." Dr. Webb was quiet for a moment. He folded his hands on his desk. "Your case was complicated, Olena. Your presentation was consistent with severe vascular disease." "But I don't have vascular disease." Dr. Chen confirmed that. "Dr. Chen reviewed imaging from years after your surgery. Things change, vascular disease can resolve, collateral circulation develops." "Or," I said, my voice steady, "there never was any vascular disease in the first place." Dr. Webb's jaw tightened. "I made a clinical decision based on the information available at the time. I believed your leg was at risk. I still believe I acted in your best interest." "My best interest?" I stood up. "My best interest would have been to keep my leg. My best interest would have been to get a second opinion. My best interest would have been to have all the imaging studies that should have been done before you cut off a healthy limb." "I don't appreciate your tone," Dr. Webb said. "I don't care," I replied. "I'm going to file a lawsuit. I'm going to report you to the medical board. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you did." I walked out of his office and didn't look back. Diane moved quickly after that. She filed a formal complaint with the medical board, detailing the missing imaging studies, the undocumented refusal of diagnostic testing, the insurance approval that happened without proper verification. She also filed a civil lawsuit against Dr. Webb and his practice for medical malpractice and negligent amputation. Dr. Webb's attorney responded within a week. They claimed that all decisions had been made appropriately, that the imaging studies had been declined by me, and that Dr. Webb had acted within the standard of care for the time. It was a lie. And I had proof. The next 3 months were brutal. I had to relive every moment of my illness, every conversation with Dr. Webb, every decision I'd made. I had to sit for depositions where Dr. Webb's attorney asked me questions designed to make me doubt my own memory. She asked if I'd been depressed before the surgery. She asked if I'd been in pain. She asked if I might have misremembered conversations from 3 years ago. Each question felt like a knife. Each question suggested that maybe I was the unreliable one. Maybe I was the one who'd made a mistake, but I had the records, and the records didn't lie. Diane hired an independent medical expert, a vascular surgeon named Dr. Raymond Torres. He reviewed all my imaging from before the surgery. He reviewed Dr. Webb's notes. He reviewed the insurance documentation. His conclusion was unambiguous. There was no medical justification for the amputation. The imaging studies that should have been done weren't done. The diagnostic process was incomplete. The surgery was performed without adequate diagnostic confirmation. Dr. Torres used a word in his report that I'd never heard before in this context: unnecessary. My leg had been amputated unnecessarily. The case moved toward trial. Dr. Webb's insurance company began making settlement offers. The first offer was for $150,000. I rejected it. The second offer was for $300,000. I rejected it. The third offer was for $500,000, with the condition that I sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing me from discussing the case publicly. I wanted to reject that too. But Diane advised me that trials were unpredictable, that juries sometimes sided with doctors, that the settlement was substantial and guaranteed. She was right, of course, but accepting it felt like accepting that what happened to me was just a financial transaction. It felt like putting a price on my leg, on my suffering, on 3 years of my life. In the end, I accepted $500,000 and refused the non-disclosure agreement. Diane negotiated that point fiercely. She argued that I had a right to tell my story, that silencing me would enable Dr. Webb to continue harming other patients. The insurance company eventually agreed. The settlement was finalized, and I was free to speak about what had happened. Free. It was a strange word to use. I was free, but I was also broken in a way that no amount of money could fix. The day I received the settlement check, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at it for an hour. Keisha was there with me. She'd taken the day off work. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. The check represented justice in a legal sense. It represented validation that what had happened was wrong. It represented acknowledgement that Dr. Webb had harmed me, but it didn't give me my leg back. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since the amputation. I looked at photographs of myself from before the surgery. I found an album from a vacation I'd taken 2 years before I got sick. I was hiking in Crater Lake. I was smiling. I had 2 legs. I was whole. I closed the album and cried. Not because I was sad, exactly, but because I was grieving something I'd already grieved, and now I had to grieve it again. I was grieving not just the loss of my leg, but the loss of the belief that it had been necessary. I was grieving the trust I'd placed in a doctor who'd betrayed that trust. I was grieving the time I'd spent believing I'd made the right choice, when really, I'd been deceived. Keisha found me in the living room, sitting in the dark. She turned on the lights and sat beside me. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't gone to see Dr. Chen, she said. I know. You'd still be believing it was necessary. You'd still be thinking you did the right thing. I know, I said again. That's the worst part, isn't it? Not just that it happened, but that you might never have known. She was right. If I hadn't been curious enough to seek a second opinion, if Dr. Chen hadn't been thorough enough to review my entire history, if I hadn't had the courage to question Dr. Webb, I would have spent the rest of my life believing a lie. The medical board's investigation took 6 months. They interviewed Dr. Webb, reviewed all the documentation, and consulted with independent experts. Their final report concluded that Dr. Webb had failed to follow the standard of care in my case. They noted that the imaging studies were incomplete, that the diagnostic process was inadequate, and that the decision to amputate was not supported by the available evidence. They suspended his medical license for 2 years. 2 years. For amputating a healthy leg. For insurance fraud. For violating the trust of a patient who'd put her life in his hands. When I read the board's decision, I felt something shift inside me. Not closure, exactly, but a kind of settling. A recognition that the system, imperfect as it was, had acknowledged what happened. Dr. Webb would not be able to harm anyone else for 2 years. After that, he could practice again, but his record would be marked. Future patients could know what he'd done. It wasn't enough. But it was something. The prosthetic in my bedroom became a different kind of object after that. It was no longer a tool I used to move through the world. It was evidence. It was a reminder of what happened when someone chose money over ethics, when someone prioritized insurance payouts over patient welfare, when someone betrayed the fundamental trust that patients place in their doctors. I stopped wearing it. I got a wheelchair instead. I told people it was easier, that my phantom pain had gotten worse, that I'd decided to stop fighting my body's reality. All of that was true, in a way. But the real reason was that I couldn't look at the prosthetic without remembering what it represented. Not adaptation or resilience, but unnecessary loss. 6 months after the settlement was finalized, I started volunteering with a patient advocacy organization. I began telling my story to groups of people who'd experienced medical malpractice. I spoke at hospitals about the importance of second opinions. I worked with lawyers on cases similar to mine. I became someone who'd survived something terrible and was determined to prevent it from happening to others. Keisha was proud of me. She told me so frequently. She said I'd turned my pain into purpose. I wasn't sure I agreed with that characterization. Purpose felt like a generous word for what I was doing. I was angry, and I was channeling that anger into something productive. That felt more accurate. A year after the settlement, I received a letter from another patient. Her name was Margaret, and she'd been diagnosed with the same condition I'd supposedly had. She'd been referred to a different orthopedic surgeon for a second opinion before proceeding with amputation. That second opinion had revealed that her condition was treatable with medication and physical therapy. She'd kept her leg. She'd written to tell me that my story had given her the courage to seek that second opinion. I read her letter 3 times. I cried when I finished it. Not because I was sad, but because something I'd endured had prevented something worse from happening to someone else. My pain had meant something. My loss had saved someone else from experiencing the same loss. It didn't make what happened to me okay, but it made it matter. 2 years after the settlement, Dr. Webb's license was reinstated. I received a notification from the medical board informing me of this fact. His record would show the suspension, but he was allowed to practice medicine again. I considered filing another complaint. I considered trying to prevent his reinstatement, but Diane advised against it. She said I'd done everything I could. She said the board had made their decision. She said it was time to move forward. She was right, though I didn't want to admit it. That evening, I sat in my wheelchair on my back porch and watched the sunset. 3 years had passed since the amputation. 3 years since my life had changed irrevocably. 3 years since I'd trusted a doctor and been betrayed. I thought about who I'd been before. I thought about the woman who could hike at Crater Lake, who could stand for hours in her garden, who could walk without thinking about it. That woman felt like someone I'd known a long time ago, someone from a different life. But I was still here. I was still alive. I was still myself, even if I was different now. The settlement money was in a trust fund that Keisha helped me manage. I'd used some of it to make my house wheelchair accessible. I'd used some of it to pay for the best physical therapy available. I'd used some of it to travel, to see places I'd always wanted to see, to live in ways that made me feel alive despite my circumstances. The rest of it sat there, a financial representation of my loss. I didn't know what to do with it. Spending it felt like accepting that the money was a fair trade for my leg. Keeping it felt like holding on to my anger. One day, Keisha suggested I donate it to medical education. She said I could establish a scholarship for students who wanted to become patient advocates. or for students who wanted to study medical ethics. She said I could use the money to prevent future doctors from making the mistakes Dr. Webb had made. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about what it would mean to take the money that represented my loss and use it to help others. I thought about whether that would feel like redemption or like erasure. In the end, I decided to do it. I established the Alina Ellis Fund for Medical Ethics at the University of Oregon School of Medicine. The fund would provide scholarships to students interested in patient advocacy and medical ethics. It would fund research into unnecessary surgical procedures. It would support initiatives to improve informed consent and second opinion protocols. When the university announced the fund, they wanted to tell my story. I agreed. I went to the medical school and spoke to a room full of future doctors. I told them about Dr. Webb. I told them about the missing imaging studies. I told them about the unnecessary amputation. I told them about the 3 years I'd spent adapting to a loss that never should have happened. I looked at their faces, young, earnest, hopeful, and I saw the people they could become. Some of them would be like Dr. Webb, choosing money over ethics. But some of them would be like the doctors who'd helped me after I realized the truth. Some of them would be like Dr. Chen, thorough and questioning and willing to challenge the status quo. I hoped my story would help them choose the right path. 3 years became 5. 5 became 7. 7 years after the amputation, I was 58 years old. I'd learned to live in my wheelchair. I'd learned to navigate a world that wasn't designed for people like me. I'd learned to find joy in small things, a good book, a day without pain, time with Keisha, conversations with other people who'd experienced medical trauma. I'd also learned something else. I'd learned that healing wasn't linear. Some days, I woke up angry about what had happened. Some days, I woke up grateful that I'd discovered the truth. Some days, I woke up devastated about my leg. Some days, I woke up proud of what I'd done with my loss. All of these feelings were valid. All of them were part of my story. One afternoon, I received a call from a journalist. She was writing a book about unnecessary medical procedures. She wanted to interview me. She wanted to include my story in her research. I agreed. We spent 3 hours on the phone. I told her everything. The symptoms that had brought me to Dr. Webb, the diagnosis that had terrified me, the surgery that I'd believed was saving my life, the discovery that it had all been unnecessary, the legal battle, the settlement, the advocacy work. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you regret not being more aggressive in your response? Do you regret not suing for more money? Do you regret accepting the settlement?" I thought about that question carefully. "No," I said finally. "I did what I needed to do to survive. I got justice in the way that was available to me. I used that justice to help other people. I can't regret that." "Even though you lost your leg?" "Especially because I lost my leg," I said. "Because if I hadn't lost my leg unnecessarily, I wouldn't have learned what I learned. I wouldn't have become who I am. I wouldn't have been able to help Margaret keep her leg. I wouldn't have been able to help other patients avoid the same fate." "So you're saying something good came out of something terrible?" "I'm saying that I took something terrible and I didn't let it destroy me. I took something terrible and I turned it into something that mattered. That's not the same as saying it was worth it. Nothing could make this worth it. But it's what I did with it." The journalist's book came out 2 years later. My story was in it. I read it once and then put it away. I didn't need to read my own story. I lived it every day. By the time I was 60, I'd given up the wheelchair for most of my home. I'd learned to move around using crutches and my prosthetic in carefully orchestrated ways. I'd learned to accept that some days I could do more than others. I'd learned to listen to my body instead of fighting it. I'd also learned to forgive myself for trusting Dr. Webb. I'd learned to forgive myself for not seeking a second opinion sooner. I'd learned to forgive myself for the 3 years I'd spent believing a lie. What I hadn't learned to do was forgive Dr. Webb, and I wasn't sure I ever would. One day, 5 years after the settlement, I saw him at the grocery store. He was in the produce section, selecting tomatoes. He looked older. He looked tired. He didn't see me at first, and I had a moment to observe him without being observed. I could have approached him. I could have said something. I could have confronted him one more time. Instead, I turned my wheelchair around and left the store. I didn't need to confront him again. I'd already done what I needed to do. I'd told my story. I'd held him accountable. I'd made sure that future patients would know what he'd done. I'd prevented him from harming others in the way he'd harmed me. That was enough. That evening, I sat with Keisha in my living room. We were drinking tea and watching the rain fall outside my window. She'd gotten married 2 years earlier to a woman named Elena. They were talking about adopting a child. My life had continued forward, even when I didn't think it could. Even when I thought I was stuck in the moment of that unnecessary amputation, life had moved on. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't gone to see Dr. Chen? Keisha asked. Every day, I said. What would have happened? I'd still be here. I'd still have lost my leg. But I'd believe it was necessary. I'd believe I'd made the right choice. I'd believe that Dr. Webb was a good doctor who'd saved my life. And instead, I know the truth. I know I was betrayed. I know I was harmed. I know that I survived it anyway. Keisha reached over and took my hand. I'm proud of you, Mom. I know, I said. I'm proud of me, too. 7 years after the amputation, I received a letter from the Oregon Medical Board. Dr. Webb had applied for early reinstatement of his full medical privileges. The board was holding a hearing to determine whether to grant it. They were inviting me to testify. I considered not going. I considered letting it go. I considered moving on. But then I thought about Margaret. I thought about all the other patients who might be vulnerable to Dr. Webb's decisions. I thought about the responsibility I had to speak up. I went to the hearing. I sat in a wheelchair across from Dr. Webb in a conference room in Portland. There was a panel of 3 board members. There was Dr. Webb's attorney. There was my attorney, Diane, who'd agreed to accompany me. I testified for 2 hours. I described my symptoms. I described my diagnosis. I described the missing imaging studies. I described the surgery. I described the discovery that it had all been unnecessary. I described the impact it had had on my life. When I finished, Dr. Webb's attorney cross-examined me. She asked if I was certain about my memories. She asked if I'd been depressed at the time. She asked if I had any regrets about the settlement I'd accepted. I answered every question calmly and directly. Then Dr. Webb testified. He said he'd made the best decision he could with the information available at the time. He said he'd acted in my best interest. He said he'd learned from the experience and would never make the same mistakes again. I wanted to stand up and call him a liar, but I didn't. I let the board members hear his words and make their own judgments. It took the board 3 weeks to reach a decision. They denied Dr. Webb's request for early reinstatement. They said the case raised significant concerns about his judgment and his adherence to the standard of care. They said he would need to complete additional training in diagnostic procedures and informed consent before they would consider his reinstatement. He would remain suspended for the full 2 years. When I heard the news, I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction, exactly, but a sense of closure. The system had worked. Justice had been served, imperfectly but meaningfully. I called Keisha and told her the news. She cried. She said she was proud of me. She said I'd done the right thing. I believed her. Now, at 63 years old, I spend my days working with the Patient Advocacy Organization and managing the Medical Ethics Fund. I speak at medical schools and hospitals. I mentor young doctors who want to learn from my experience. I help patients who've experienced medical malpractice navigate the legal system. I've learned to live in my wheelchair. I've learned to adapt to my prosthetic when I wear it. I've learned to move through the world as a person with a disability, which is different from how I moved through it before. But not worse, just different. I've learned that trauma doesn't define you unless you let it. I've learned that betrayal can lead to wisdom. I've learned that loss can lead to purpose. Most importantly, I've learned that the truth matters. It matters that I discovered my amputation was unnecessary. It matters that I spoke up about it. It matters that I used my pain to help others. My left leg is gone. That's a fact that will never change. But the story of my leg, the story of what happened to it, why it happened, and what I did about it, that story belongs to me. That story is mine to tell, and I tell it every day. If you've experienced medical trauma or betrayal, speak up, seek second opinions, question authority. Your story matters, and so does your truth.